There are certain moments in Western art that just stand on their own. They need no explanation, no analysis. No explanation can do them justice because they are so powerful, so iconic as representations of a particular feeling, experience. They just capture something that sticks in the mind, like that painting by Caspar David Friedrich, The Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. There's nothing quite like it. The minute you see it, you recognize it, and it just speaks directly into the heart of a moment. Or, the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet, the moment in Super Mario where Toad tells you that the princess is in another castle, these sorts of great triumphs, iconic triumphs of Western literature. We're coming up on one now, and we've been working our way through the Aeneid, and we are finally at the end of Book 4, which means, my friends, with genuine sorrow and melancholy, I never come up on this without getting hit in the feels, it is time for us to say goodbye to Queen Dido of Carthage. Well, we've been following this love story since book 1 of the poem, from the opening. It's been going on in the background even of books 2 and 3, where Aeneas tells his story of war, but it's all been leading up to this, and the scene in which Aeneas and Dido finally confront one another, and Aeneas has to turn away and move on toward Italy, is just one of those ineradicable moments. It's something that once you read it for the first time, if you really are paying attention to it, if you've really connected with these characters up to this moment, it never leaves you. It never goes away. It becomes a part of your soul. And there are just countless reproductions, recreations of this moment in the Galleria Borghese in Rome, which is one of my favorite museums in the entire world. There is a Dido room just devoted to this whole story and this tragedy. There have been operas made about it. There's art down throughout the years. And so to connect, to really grasp everything that's going on here is obviously important for our series on the Aeneid, but it's also a key to a whole wing of the grand museum that is Western art. This is a room in the Western soul, and I would argue in the human soul more generally, because the themes that we encounter here aren't just limited to Rome. They're not just limited to the West or to America or to any nation or people that might inherit this text. These are eternal themes. And one of the things that T.S. Eliot once said is that a great poet in writing himself writes his time. And part of what that means is that by connecting to particular human events, these human scale realities, we kind of, the more we drill down, counterintuitively, paradoxically, the more we drill down into the specifics of one human experience, the more universal it can become. Because in the particulars of our lives in the here and now, we embody these eternal absolute truths. And this is what Dido is. She is, in some sense, standing in for every woman scorned in all of literature. And there's something about this period in literature, the Augustan era, which is the beginning of Rome's empire, there's something about this period that is particularly pregnant with that kind of meaning, with the meaning that gathers up everything that has gone before and kind of puts a pin on it in one distilled image or icon. And in Dido, as Aeneas turns away from her, we really do have not just this one woman, although she is fully realized as an individual character. We also have a woman who stands in for, speaks for, and embodies all of the abandoned and broken women that we've encountered throughout Greek and Roman literature. Greek myth is filled with this particular heartache that women suffer in a world that is so very much defined by warfare and bloodshed and struggle and conquest and all of these things that men do to build civilizations. Women have this counterpart, and it's often remarked upon in Greek tragedy that the kind of counterpart for that, for the women, is to build the civilizations, to create the culture. But that brings this incredible pain and this incredible burden, and often, not always, but often, women are casualties. They're collateral damage in these stories, these male stories of war and nation building. And that's not a political commentary. That's not a feminist or anti-feminist commentary. It's just an observation about the world that has been made from time immemorial, that these great nation building projects, which cost men so much. Men have to struggle and strive and pour their energy and their effort and sometimes their lives into this effort of building civilization. It also costs women just as much, but in a different way. And so Dido and Aeneas here are both losing something. It's typical, I think. It's pretty common for people to come to this scene and ask, well, who did who more wrong, right? Does Aeneas hurt Dido more? Does Dido misuse her love? Does she get carried away by this degraded passion or this infected passion? It's hard to see how she could have avoided it, given that she's got this divine power over her, the power of Venus and Cupid or Amor. But more generally, I think that speaks to the fact that Virgil's really not thinking in those terms. He's not thinking in terms of like who's in the right and who's in the wrong in this tragedy of the heart. He's thinking in terms of destiny and fate always. He's thinking about the human beings caught in the grip of something larger than themselves, and the gods really stand in for that. The battle between the gods over whose city is gonna win and all of that is kind of what we would think of as like capital H history working itself out. And Aeneas, as I've said before, has a job to do within that history that trumps everything else, even legitimate things. And I think in America, in our modern way of looking at things, we like for there to be a right answer so that we can have a neat moral to the story and there can be at least an idea of what a happy ending would look like. And I think we're trained in that really by Hollywood and by the kinds of pop culture that we tend to like. Virgil's not thinking that way either. And Greeks and Romans, I don't think, tended to think so much that way. They tended to think more in terms of tragedy, that we humans are often caught up in these grand designs of history, and maybe everyone's flawed and no one's quite in the right, and maybe there's no way to work this situation out that doesn't end with somebody getting dreadfully hurt, or maybe everybody paying a terrible cost. That said, there's definitely morality at play in this story, and we talked last time about how neither Aeneas nor Dido quite manages the situation optimally, how they really like need some couples therapy. And I talked a little bit about that last time. I'm going to kind of leave that behind now and just look at the fallout, because that's what we're left to deal with here at the end. And it really is a huge turning point for Aeneas, and as Aeneas represents Rome, it's a turning point for Rome and for Virgil's commentary on Rome as well. Where we last left our heroes, you'll perhaps recall, Aeneas was doing this very recognizably human kind of dance where he knew he had to go. Hermes had come. There was a recreation of the scene from Calypso's island in the Odyssey where Hermes comes down and he gives this announcement that, you must move on. The gods do not desire that this sort of way station should become your permanent home. In the Odyssey, it's Calypso that has to be convinced of that because she's in love with Odysseus. Odysseus is already weeping, longing to go home. Here, it's slightly different dynamic in that Aeneas is the one who has to be shocked into recollection of his destiny. There's some sense that maybe he's gotten waylaid. He's definitely receded from the story. We talked about how his name isn't mentioned in the marriage. He's become kind of passive. He's become a passive participant in this now totally disordered love affair. And so Hermes comes and he says, what the heck are you doing? Think at least of your line. Don't just think about yourself, think about your ancestry, and especially about what you owe to the generations to come, to Iulus, that is to say Ascanius, your son, who is owed regna, realms. That's the word that keeps coming up again and again. You have to think about your legacy. You have to think about the realms that your kids will inherit, and so you gotta go. And now Aeneas knows this, but he really does not know how he can possibly break it to Dido. And he's sort of skulking around, trying to wait for the right moment, but also making his ships ready in secret. He's got his buddies all around him, and they're eager, champing at the bit to go. He is dragging his feet about how to tell Dido. And Dido, meanwhile, has found out because, and there's this wonderful line, quis fallere possit amantem, who can deceive a lover, or one who loves. And so Virgil tells us that Regina praesensit, she kind of pre-sensed, she had a premonition, or she felt in advance what was about to happen. And she saw that this was going down. And that's a very realistic description to me, actually. If you think about relationships that are falling apart, and you think about like dynamics that you know aren't right, most of the worst breakups you can kind of feel coming like a storm on the horizon. And that's kind of what happens here with Dido. And so she essentially forces the confrontation. He says, now Aeneas tells her, I was going to tell you, I was looking for a time to let you know. I personally think that's a little bit of an open question. You can take him at his word, or you can say with me that I think he was kind of not really, his heart was not in it. He wasn't really excited about the prospect, as who would be, of telling Dido that they have to put an end to this. But she then bursts into his kind of inner turmoil, and she does so, they say hurt people. She does so in a way that is expressive of her grief and her anger and her pain, probably not the best way to approach it. And she makes a bunch of different accusations at him, some of which are kind of unhinged, some of which are pretty valid. I think her best argument here is, I gave up everything for you, right? Dido was doing fine when Aeneas came along. In fact, Virgil went out of his way to show that Dido was doing great when Aeneas was at his lowest. We meet Aeneas in a point of profound vulnerability. He's wishing he was dead. He's in despair and uncertainty about his path forward, washes up in this seemingly unfriendly shore, and lo and behold, he's welcomed by this like almost Amazonian queen, right? This person who has herself escaped from potential disaster, from her plotted murder. She's made her way to North Africa, and she's really made a life for herself here. She's building an amazing city called Carthage, and Aeneas is amazed at everything that's going on, and says again and again, and would love to stay. And this is kind of something he reiterates again and again. So she says, look, I was doing fine. I had basically closed the book on romance after the death of my first husband. Then you roped me back into this, and I gave up everything for you, right? I put myself in danger because now remember the surrounding the cities that are around her are angry that she's rejected their suitors, and instead she's gone with this Phrygian, this foreigner who's made his way in from Troy. There's bad blood now everywhere around her, and now that Aeneas is gone, she's lost her protection, right? She's lost her kind of comrade in arms, and she's totally sunk, essentially. And so she basically says, like, how can you justify this when I was doing fine, you came along and you, like, roped me into this love affair? I think his best answer to that is, I never asked you to do that. And there is something, I think, very real and human about this as well. And that is, a lot of the time people will kind of martyr themselves and then expect that you must, like, martyr yourself in return. Like, often when a relationship falls apart, one party will say, look at everything I did for you. Look at how I moved across the country to be with you. Look at how I, abandoned my family when they told me that you were no good. I stood up for you. I did all these things. It's like, did the other party ask you to do any of that? Aeneas kind of, egged Dido on a little bit, but he also just kind of stood there and was hot and interesting, and she was taken over by this passionate love that has led her into this disaster. But now comes the other element of this that we have to reckon with, which is that the love was instilled in Dido by the poison of the gods. And on one level, we can interpret this as a kind of representation of what it's like to be carried away with passion, and all of that is true. But on another register, another level, this is very, very real for Virgil. This is not just like a metaphor or an image. It is also a claim about a real feature of the world, which is that there is a grand design to the pattern of history, and we are just figures woven into that tapestry. We are not the main character. Even the main character kind of isn't the main character, and that's part of the point here. Very, very different way of thinking about things than the kind of hyper-individualistic, like, follow your heart, live your truth. From that perspective, I think Aeneas bears a lot more blame, right? From the perspective of he's just somebody that needs to, like, he's an individual, an autonomous individual responsible for his own actions. Like, yeah, he should probably, at this point, he's like obligated to Dido. From the larger perspective where history is a reality and moral obligation and duty is not just something that we owe to our individual relationships, but to this larger fabric of culture and civilization, Aeneas is not just responsible to Dido, he's responsible, as Hermes reminds him, to his ancestry, to the remnants of Troy that he carries with him, embodied in his father Anchises and the Lares and Penates, the household gods, and he's responsible to posterity, to his child, his son, who is destined to inherit this realm in Italy. And so, on that level, all the other concerns that we might talk about and have been talking about kind of vanish. They kind of pass away. And this is essentially the argument that Aeneas ultimately presents. It's not a callous argument. He can come across as kind of callous if you read this poem too quickly, and if you read it from too much of a modern perspective, you can be like, man, why is this guy just such a sort of heartless rock? But in fact, if you read his arguments carefully, you realize that this hurts him very, very deeply. And in fact, later on down the line in Book 6, we're going to see how profoundly it hurts him. But even now, it's not lost on him that he has to do something terrible to found Rome in this moment. And yet it must be done. Even though perhaps he made a mistake in getting into this situation in the first place, he would make an even greater mistake if he were not to put an end now and cut his losses and move on. So here's a speech, part of his speech that I've translated for you. As always, I'm translating into Alexandrines here. One of my favorite things to do is to write these original translations so that you guys can experience the poem afresh with me. And this is a very moving sort of moment in the poem when Aeneas basically makes the argument that I just made. He says, "My father, Anchises, each time the night's slick shadows cloak the earth, each time the firelit stars arise, his grizzled specter comes to warn me in my dreams. It terrifies me." So this is, in some ways, it's almost like reporting Hermes' arguments from before. In Homer, this would probably be a full-on rote repetition of the speech. In Homer, you often get, like, the god will deliver some message, or Zeus will tell the god to deliver a message, and then the god will come and deliver the message in exactly the same words, and then maybe somebody else will tell about the gods in exactly the same words. Here, remember, this is a written poem, and so there's less room for kind of expansive repetition, and more room for close, careful retellings and slight reworkings based on the voice of each individual character. So that's what Aeneas kind of does here. He foregrounds the arguments that I think are going to really land with Dido, and that probably reflect his experience, that he is most emotionally connected to his father, who, remember, has died not long ago, and that has left him kind of adrift. Now he comes in the night. "It terrifies me, and the boy, Ascanius, and all the wrong I heap upon his darling head by cheating him of reign and of his destiny." That's that word, regno hesperii fraudo. I cheat him out of his reign, and his darling head is a nice addition there to kind of move, I think, Dido as well, because Dido actually really loves Iulus. There's a moment in Book 1 where she's sort of dandling him, fondling him on her lap, And he says, "The boy Ascanius and all the wrong I heap upon his darling head, the citadels he's promised in Hesperia. At this point, even Heaven's emissary, sent from Jove himself, I swear it on my life, brings orders on the darting winds. I saw the god myself within my walls, before my eyes. He walked in light." There is at this moment, and Virgil is such an artist, man. He really would have been a great writer of movie screenplays, because the voices of these characters come through so clearly. There's a moment here of, like, the bro is stammering a little bit, I think the emphatic, I swear it on my life, even Heaven's emissary, etiam is the word in Latin, etiam interpres divam, which is a great name for Hermes, because he's the god of languages and messages. He's the emissary, is the way I've translated it. So he sent from Jove himself, I swear it on my life, Testor utrumque caput. On my own head, I swear it. Brings orders on the darting winds. I saw the god myself within my walls. Before my eyes, he walked in light. Now he's got his footing back a little bit. And he really kind of lays it on. And this is where he can seem a bit harsh. But I think it's just reflective of the fact that there's something ruthless about what he has to do here. These ears of mine drank in his voice. So stop. Decine, so stop, and don't inflame yourself or me with grievances. It's not my will I'm following to Italy. This is a very famous line. It's a concept he repeats several times. Italiam non sponte sequor. And there's something very important here about the history of the poem, which I think is really cool. These are these little like Easter eggs that you can get into if you really want to kind of pick the poem apart. This line, Italiam non sponte sequor, is what you would technically call unfinished. And that's because the poem, much like an epic poem by, say, Milton in English, the poem has a regular meter. Every line is a certain number of syllables long. And so we can tell when a line is not that number of syllables, that it is not, as it were, complete. It doesn't fill out the whole line. And you can maybe hear that I'm being a little bit careful about how I describe this, because there is this very just kind of endlessly fascinating mystery associated with these unfinished lines. And there are a number of them throughout the poem. Typically, this is taken as evidence that Virgil died with the poem unfinished. And that was the view of things in antiquity. And I think still probably the most likely reality is that it's almost certain he didn't want this thing put out in the version that it now is. It's one of those classic stories of an artist, trying to not being satisfied with his magnum opus before death and wanting it burned and destroyed. But instead, thank God, it was preserved and it exists in this form, still very beautifully constructed, still kind of perfect. What really gets me about it, though, is that in this line, if you did take it as an intentional unfinished line, like if you said, okay, maybe Virgil didn't get to work on this poem as long as he wanted, but what if this unfinished line was actually supposed to be there? You could come up with a really good explanation for it, right? Italiam non sponte sequor. What more is there to say? There is this resounding, terrible silence that falls at the end of this line. And so one way of saying that is just, well, this is providence, right? There is some kind of artistic power at work beyond even what the individual artist can intend or plan, that has, like the hand of God, reached down and left this line unfinished. And now it sits there just like almost ahead of its time in the way that it uses, kind of plays with the form. Because it would be very, very unusual for a classical artist to violate the meter of an epic in this way, intentionally, to do it on purpose. If it's an accident, you can just say, well, Virgil didn't mean it, but it's still kind of nice that way. If he did mean it, or if he never finished it because he couldn't quite bring himself to find more words to put into the end of that line, that's even more interesting. And the reason I dwell on this is because there are many, many issues of interpretation in this poem that hinge on whether or not Virgil meant to leave this or that part unfinished. And when we get to the end, when we finish the whole poem, we'll find the one that has most troubled and perplexed readers throughout all of history, one that really defines kind of how you understand Virgil's relationship to history. But here we get a taste of it, right? As you start to think, like, okay, to what degree is this poem unfinished, and in what ways is it unfinished, and does Virgil mean for it to be unfinished in this particular point? My guess, and I'm truly, I think it's kind of any educated person can make a guess here, but as somebody who reads these sorts of poems all the time and has done for a very long time, my guess is that it's probably too good to be true that this would be an intentionally unfinished line. If anything, it's just the kind of providence or the beauty of the vicissitudes of history that has reached down and kind of cut this line off at the perfect moment. And probably Virgil, if I can observe that, I'm sure Virgil could have thought that through, even though he may have intended ultimately to find a way to finish that line. But as it stands, the poem is the poem. What we have is what we have. And this line really just speaks to me, or it really hits me at the end of this just heartbreaking departure that he has to make, and you do feel that he's not he's not doing it like out of spite or hatred. Just the opposite. If anything, he would try everything he possibly could to stay, but he simply cannot, and that is what makes him Pius Aeneas. He is pious Aeneas, and that's a word that is really his epithet, the word that gets attached to him all the time. Now, when we say pious, we kind of mean like he goes to church a lot, and sometimes it's got a negative connotation, like, oh, this person is such a holier than thou kind of jerk, he's so pious. That's not what this means at all. This is pious in the sense of dutiful toward the gods, and it's even bigger than we would think of that being now, because the gods in ancient Rome and in the ancient world are threaded throughout all of life. They are what's called immanent, which is to say they dwell in the entire universe. And nowadays you could imagine saying, well, he's very pious in that he has an active faith life, but he also has these other activities that are sort of unrelated to his piety, right? Technically, we would think that true piety would affect every aspect of your life, but we still have this division between the divine and the secular, where we say, like, yeah, he's a very pious guy. Also, he loves Led Zeppelin, and like that there's a way that we have of cutting in our minds, dividing up our activities and our attitudes in the world. Even if that is more of a fluid, mushy line than we think, we still have that idea. There's no idea of that in the ancient concept of pietas, piety. This is somebody who observes what the gods would want or demand in every circumstance and situation. And this would be a classic example. He's gotten a direct divine message. There's no ambiguity here. And that's another reason why Hermes is a great god to have delivered this command, is that Aeneas has been kind of faffing about. He's been dilly-dallying and shilly-shallying and being like, well, did God really say? How can I be sure, like, what my goal is? Do I even know where to go? And you can imagine that would be a very comforting sort of ambiguity as he faces this impossible challenge of leaving Dido behind. And as he gets deeper and deeper embedded in the relationship, and as the relationship starts to take on as kind of toxic relationships can, you get tangled up in them, and you really don't want to be in them, but you also really, really, really don't want to leave. You don't want to do the breakup. You can very easily start to get into these, like, you can start to feign a degree of uncertainty that you don't actually feel when your heart knows what you're supposed to do. But you can say, well, is it really what I'm supposed to do? And this is why Hermes is great, because he's the interpres divum. He is the interpreter of the divine will. And he has now come down to make clear that there is no ambiguity about it. No ifs, ands, or buts. Jove is like literally parting the heavens and saying, this is what I intend for you to do. This is the plan. There's no ambiguity here. And so now Aeneas doesn't have that shield, but what makes him Pius Aeneas is that when he is deprived of that, and when he sees clearly, the god walks in light, says without any uncertainty, this is what Jove wants of you, this is what your task is and what your destiny is, that's what he does. He does that instead of denying it and fighting against it or whatever. He summons somewhere, somehow in his character is that strength, and it is a terrible strength, and a strength that none of us should want, I think, to have to summon. But he does have it, and many of us do sometimes need to show it. He has to do what must be done, even though the cost is terrible. And the cost truly is terrible. And this is why Virgil is a great artist, is because he doesn't, just because it has to be done, just because Aeneas has to leave, he doesn't make it okay. He doesn't say, and then, like, he strode forth as the great hero, and wasn't it awesome that he created Rome? He says, no, now you're going to look, I'm going to force you to look at the unfolding of the disaster, the catastrophe, the wreckage that you leave in your trail when you do this sort of thing. And he does it in the person of Dido, who breaks down into the scorned woman of all antiquity. And I said before that this is kind of what you would think of as a trope or a type scene. this is a sort of scene, just like the wreckage at sea, the storm at sea is a classic scene that's in many different epics throughout time. The ekphrasis, the description of a work of art, is in many different epics, many different poems from the ancient world. The lament of the abandoned woman is kind of a type scene. We get it in a lot of different poems. And here, this is why I say that Augustan literature is so good for this stuff. You kind of get like the distillation of it. And in some ways, Virgil almost gives you the like archetypal version, the perfect version of this scene, so that nobody ever has to do this scene again. And in fact, we do kind of move on into other different female archetypes. Like after this moment, Dido is the definitive woman scorned, and she speaks for many other women scorned that we're going to get into in a bit. There's a video online where they take a bunch of portraits of women from like 500 years of female portraiture, it's called, and they kind of meld, it's before AI, but it looks a little bit like AI, like they meld each portrait into one another. And what I love about the video is it kind of like, it's like one of my favorite concepts, a palimpsest, where the past is written behind the future, and they're all stacked up on top of one another. And at certain points, like, oh, it's all one. The spirit of one woman is kind of like moving through these portraits, and from that vantage point, you can see that. That's kind of Virgil's vantage point. Virgil is standing at the end of something, of the Roman Republic, of the triumph of Greek culture over Roman civilization, right? He's looking back on all of that, and he's compiling it, stacking it up into this one moment that gives it this charge and this power over and above even all the pain of the individual relationship that we've just been talking about. So that's I think what makes this speech just like unbearable, historic, enduring, all of any adjective that you could apply to it. It's a famous speech. I've translated some of it. It really is worth reading the whole thing. And if you're not reading the poem along with us as we do this series, you really should. But let me get into some of the most famous lines here. I forget who it was who said that this speech would have made a stone weep, but it again, it's a testament to Virgil's artistic power that he's able to do this and that he chooses to do it rather than give you an easy out in the obligation that Aeneas does in fact have. So here's what Dido says. She says, "No goddess bore you, and it wasn't Dardanus who started such a bloodline as the one you came from. Liar! Harsh and bristling mountain crags produced you. Tigresses on Caucasus gave suck to you. Now why should I conceal or hold my feelings back for some enormity to come? And did he sigh to hear us weeping? Did he turn his gaze on us? Or was he overcome with tears or with compassion for the one who loves him? What's there left to say? Not now. No, highest Juno couldn't look with favor, not on this, nor Jove, the son of Saturn." I'm going to go on. There's more here, but I want to point out a couple things about this speech. First of all, there's an old concept, and we're going to get more into this in just a second, but we've sort of experienced this, that hating somebody is one thing, but hating somebody after you have loved them is actually in some ways more bitter and potent, and nobody can really hate you like your ex. This is why if all my exes live in Texas, I hang my hat in Tennessee, right? I wish I could live in Texas, but the reason that your ex is such a powerful figure is because they have loved you, and therefore they have known you. To really love somebody, right, is to know them. There's some way in which you can't fully know somebody unless you have compassion and understanding and love, and unless you look at them with a certain degree of generosity, which is what love creates. But when love curdles, and this is why love can be such a dangerous god in the myths, when love curdles, then all of that knowledge that you have of the person can become barbed, can be weaponized in service of your hatred. And so nobody can really get under your skin like an ex-lover. Nobody can really accuse you like an ex-lover of things that you personally feel a little bit guilty of yourself. And so what Dido is doing here is at once completely accurate and totally unfair, which I think is like incredibly painful. So she goes after his ancestry, right? Because he just said, it's my ancestry I'm thinking about. It's posterity. It's the line of kings. It's all of this, like, kind of civilizational concern that I have, this weight that sits upon me. And again, the reality of that weight is intense in the poem. We can't escape that real obligation that Aeneas has. And she goes after that by playing on all his insecurities. No goddess bore you. You don't have divine lineage. You're a liar, perfide. What could you say to a person who thinks of himself as the pious one to make him really doubt himself? Well, you're dishonest, right? You are a liar. You don't keep your vows. You don't keep your oaths. We've already been over how it's a little bit unclear whether Aeneas actually did make the oaths that Dido thinks that he made, but she's got this, like, remember at the beginning of book 4 how rapturous she was about the beauty of Aeneas and his endurance and all of his strength, and he's got such a great chest and he's so handsome, but he's also lived, the poor dear, through such difficult things, right? All of that love has given her ammunition for this speech. And so now when she calls him liar, harsh and bristling mountain crags, he knows he's being harsh, right? He already knows he's being ruthless. That's what makes this so difficult, and he's asking for her to understand. I think it might be too much to ask, right? I think that there's a way in which you can ask that, and maybe she should give that, but it's like a bridge too far for the way that she has been chewed up and spat out by, not by Aeneas so much as by history, right? This other line that really gives me pause, and I love thinking about this line, quid dissimulo, nam, quid dissimulo. Now, why should I conceal or hold my feelings back? She's basically saying, look, like, I'm pulling no punches, right? And we all know, I guess, that in relationships, in love affairs, in marriages even, like, there are some things that we think but don't say, right? It's actually not good to be 100% honest 100% of the time in any relationship, romantic or whatever, because some of our thoughts are cruel and uncharitable, and they're passed through our minds things that we would rather not say, right? And we wait until we've cooled off and we say them in a more loving way and all of these things, yada yada. This is the sort of stuff that couples therapy could potentially teach Dido and Aeneas. But she's saying, look, you've broken all of that, right? Our relationship is in shards at my feet. You've destroyed it. So what's holding me back from just, like, totally letting loose, right? Totally letting fire with all of the nasty things that I've been thinking. But there's an interesting implication of that, which is that those nasty things have been bubbling up for Dido, right? And it's similar to when Virgil says, like, she presensed it. She sensed it in advance that Aeneas was pulling away. For nobody can deceive a lover. You get the feeling, well, okay, maybe there is stuff that Dido, like, hasn't been saying, and not just the passing thoughts of nastiness that maybe we all keep back, but maybe there are larger anxieties she's had about the relationship that she hasn't put forward, that she hasn't, like, been open about. And she's like, well, now it's all coming out, right? You want to be open, like, let's be open. And this is, again, like, very relatable, very understandable, not the best way to deal with or cope with your anxieties, right, about a relationship. And so she's now, like, the floodgates are opened, and all of the angst and stresses and uncertainties that I think we're supposed to feel have been going on already. All the worries that she's been having are being let loose in this torrent of rage. And now she truly, she transitions from the heartbroken woman into, like, the Maiad on the storm. There's a wonderful line in Shelley's Ode to the West Wind where he compares the clouds. He calls them the locks of the approaching storm. I think it's like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce Maenad. And the Maenads, or the Bacchantes, are the ones driven wild by Bacchic fury, and Dido is very much being compared to that here. So it's totally like she rises up. If this were a video game or a movie, like a fantasy movie, the clouds would start darkening and swirling around her, and she would, like, kind of rise up into the air, and her hair would be everywhere. Think of, like, Galadriel in the Lord of the Rings movies, right? Instead of a dark lord, you would have a queen, not dark, but bright and terrible as the sun. All shall love me and despair. Like, that's kind of what we're getting here from Dido, and boy, howdy does she give it. There's a wonderful Latin word, untranslatable, one syllable, which means go. Go on, go chasing Italy upon the winds, and hunt your precious kingdoms all across the waves. See how she spits that word, regna, the realms, the kingdoms, back in his face. Hunt your precious kingdoms all across the waves. I hope you even, if there's any holy power, find yourself impaled amid the rocky crags, inhaling pain and calling out the name of Dido more than once. And I'll be there, with you and absent, right behind you in the darkened flames. And then, when frigid death has drawn my soul and limbs apart, I'll be in every shadow, everywhere, and you wretch, will pay. It's a barn burner of a speech. It just, like, every line of it is like that. Every line of it has some gem in it, some amazing thing. Some of these prophecies, curses, are kind of going to come true. Some of them can't. She can't stop him from going to Rome. That's what she's in such terrible pain that she wants him shipwrecked and destroyed, right? Inhaling pain, calling out the name of Dido. There's plenty of suffering that's about to happen, plenty of trial that Aeneas still has to go through, but she can't stop him from doing the thing. And so there's something kind of piteous about this curse, even as it's also true that she has friends in high places, and we are going to meet Dido again. We haven't seen the last of Dido. We will see her in Book 6 in the underworld, and it's at that moment, really, that Aeneas will confront the fullness of this suffering and sorrow. And I'm going to save that for when we do Book 6. But, I mean, the combination here of, like, unhinged and unreasonable violence in her attack, which we've all maybe felt or suffered or wanted to unleash in a moment in a bad breakup or whatever, right? The combination of that with, like, real understandable, totally sympathetic heartbreak, right? For somebody that really did not deserve this fate. The pathos of it is, like, dialed up to 11. And there's a really interesting, it's funny, so I have no idea how this scholar Judith Hallett found me. I got an email from her after I did my episode on couples therapy for Dido and Aeneas, but she sent me this piece that she wrote as part of a collection which I really enjoyed. It's called Can Love Alleviate the Unseen Wounds of War? So she sent it to me. I'll drop a link to it in the description, but it's about the particular role that Dido has been asked to play, and she compares it to all these other stories that we get in the ancient world. And we talked about this when I talked about Homer, stories of veterans coming home, right? And one thing that Aeneas is, in addition to being a wanderer and a future founder and a destined city builder, is he is a veteran of a terrible war, right? We've talked about this before. He's working out his trauma. He's been invited, in some sense, by Dido to trauma dump. And Hallett points out that this is a role that other women play in other epics that Dido is sort of clearly meant to be modeled after. So Calypso is a classic example. And then even the queen of the Phaeacians in the Odyssey, when Odysseus tells the majority of his story, we talked about how it's all told in retrospect, just the way Aeneas' story Troy is told. And this is what we would now call processing, right? This is like unloading onto a therapeutic figure. This is kind of like letting your grief out by talking about it. All of that, I think, is very much like, we didn't invent that in the therapeutic age. Like, the ancients knew that talking about something was part of processing it, putting a button on it. If you want more on this, there's a lot in it about it in my episodes on the Odyssey, that, you know, when Odysseus tells his story, he's able to kind of work out some of the grief and the trauma. But Hallett, as I am reading this, as I read this essay, and you know, since she apparently listens to my show, maybe she will tell me if I'm wrong. As I read her, one of the things she's saying is that Calypso, especially, but all of these prior figures before Dido, they almost occupy the role that a therapist would occupy in this very specific way, which is that they're ultimately kind of invulnerable. Like, Calypso does suffer a lot of pain when Odysseus leaves, but she's also a goddess, right? She's going to live forever. Dido, as we'll find out in a moment, is very much not going to live forever. And Calypso, just like a therapist, kind of sits and is trained to receive your trauma and has like techniques for not letting it totally overwhelm him or her, right? That's part of the point of the therapist, is that they kind of can like listen to you unload all of that without themselves getting despondent about it or falling into despair. These prior models for Dido kind of have that quality to them, that they are these divine beings, or they're, in the case of the Phaeacians, they're sort of like utopian, like they're a utopian civilization. They live in bliss. Homer seems to have invented them almost explicitly for this purpose, to like kind of receive the Odyssean trauma dump. And Dido is not, right? And Virgil is profoundly aware of that Dido is human, and Dido is not equipped to just like receive, to be the sounding board, to be used up and chewed up and spit out in this way. And so in that way, she's much less like Calypso, even though Calypso is an obvious model here, and much more like Medea or even Ariadne. And these are also women who are in one way or another kind of wronged or abandoned by men. With Medea, she helps Jason and the Argonauts, you may recall, and she comes up in, there's a play by Euripides called the Medea. There's also an epic by Apollonius called the Argonautica, in which Medea is very, very clearly a model for Virgil as well as Calypso. Medea, we've talked about this actually already, that Medea is the victim of a love plot, just like Dido is. It's orchestrated by the goddesses, by Juno and Athena, in that case, and Aphrodite is kind of their accomplice in the Argonautica. But Medea in Euripides, who is, again, very famous and probably the all-time archetype for the Galadriel riding on the waves, the Maenad with her hair lifted up by some fierce power, right? That's Medea is like classic version of that. She ends up at the end like on a chariot drawn by dragons, but she goes completely off the handle. She does unspeakable things. She is also wronged, right? And so it's the pathos there. It's almost like each of these different characters is like a different angle on the woman that Dido will eventually become. Like she has this almost cubist. If you look at cubist paintings where you have all these different angles combined into one, like Dido is almost this like cubist amalgam of all these different stories of women being victims of like male civilization building, essentially. And if you look at her from one angle, she's one way, and you look at her from another angle, she's another way. But Euripides says something in Medea that's particularly, I think, acute or powerful for this, which is, in every other area, a woman's filled with fear. She's no good faced with war or iron swords. But when a woman finds that she's been wronged in matters of the bedroom, then there's nothing else as wild at heart with rage. This is a sentiment that is very much kind of alive in the tragedies in Apollonius. It's also very much, I mentioned Ariadne. It shows up in Catullus' poem 64. Catullus was a poet of shorter poems mostly, but 64 is a long story, an ekphrasis in which we have the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, and then there's a bedsheet where Ariadne shows up, and it goes into the whole story, but she makes Ariadne, who has been abandoned by Theseus, having helped him out in much the same way that Medea helped Jason out. She gets abandoned, and she says something that obviously made a big impact on Virgil. She says, "What lioness bore you beneath that lonely crag? What sea conceived and spewed you from its foamy crest?" Right? This is the Hyrcanian lions or the Hyrcanian tigresses, rather, that Dido says gave birth to Aeneas. There's like many, many different influences kind of converging in one here. But this idea of the woman scorned, right, which we get in the Medea, has a long history. You've probably heard the idea that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. It actually comes, and this is a fun fact to trot out at cocktail parties if you really want to be annoying. It actually comes from a play by William Congreve from 1967, so a little bit after Shakespeare. It's a play called The Mourning Bride, and it's one of these, I think, rather convoluted tragedies about love and betrayal and so forth. But in Act 3, Scene 2, the queen, Zara, has this speech: "Heaven has no rage like love to hatred turned, nor hell a fury like a woman scorned." So you'll note that actually hath is not in there. We've kind of like lifted this up out of its own thing. The original is very much like the sentiment that I was just expressing earlier, that your ex knows you best, and so is able to hate you most, right? Heaven hath no rage like love to hatred turned. There's a lot of great lines actually in this play, despite the fact that it's not like one of my favorites in the world. There's the other famous one is what music has charms to soothe a savage breast, which is often misquoted as charms to soothe a savage beast. But music has charms to soothe a savage breast, to soften rocks or bend a knotted oak. So anyway, this whole idea that hell hath no fury, that once you are scorned in love, then you become sort of formidable in this womanly way, is very powerful. It goes back to Medea, at least. And here, it's powerful, but it's also piteous, because Virgil has contrived, I think on purpose, to put Dido in the most sympathetic possible position. And in that way, she sort of reminds me, there's this wonderful musical called Epic. If you've ever been on Spotify to hear this musical, people ask me about this all the time. I've talked about it on the show before, but since people keep asking me about it, I assume that this is something you want to hear more about. There's a great musical called it's like a, I don't know if you would call it a closet opera or what, because it's not been staged, but this creator on Spotify, Jorge Rivera Herons is his name. He has put out this like sort of song saga that details the journey of Odysseus back home. And when he gets to the Calypso story, one of the things he does is he kind of turns Calypso into this modern musical theater heroine, and she has a song called "I'm Not Sorry for Loving You," which is very I found it very touching, and I'll link to it also in the show notes. Just like this kind of painful, like she does let him go in a way that Dido doesn't, but she does it in this way that it's like, you know, I'm not angry, I'm just like sort of tired and sad, and there's that element to it too, where Dido, you know, has taken on so much, has played an important role in Aeneas' journey, and now is going to be relegated to the status of like this tragic figure. It's awful to see her brought low. And what she ultimately does is horrifying. She has to lie to her sister, her beloved sister Anna, about what she intends to do. She says she wants to perform a sacrifice. What she's actually doing is she's committing suicide. And Juno sends the rainbow goddess Iris down to basically draw her soul away from her body. And so she performs like this ultimate act of self-destruction, self-sacrifice, which wouldn't have been quite so immoral, I guess, from the pagan perspective as from the Christian perspective, but it's certainly, I think, meant to show that she has been ruined, destroyed by this love affair. She's given into it at points. She's probably not been blameless in the way that it's gone awry, but ultimately she is a victim of it in the same way that Aeneas is, which is to say that they are both being caught up in the pitiless jaws of fate. It's extremely tragic. Aeneas is desperate to fix things as he leaves before she dies. There's this wonderful set of lines that Virgil gives us. He says, "Aeneas, ever pious, longed to ease her pain, to comfort her and brush away her cares with words. He groaned, but though his soul's resolve grew weak with love, the orders of the gods were firm. He followed them." That to me is the best part of the whole book, actually, where we see that he wants to reach out, he wants to comfort her. When somebody you love is hurting like that, right? The thing that you long to do most is like wipe the tears away. There's nothing he can do. All he can do is hurt her. He's been like, he's now reached a point, whether he's to blame or not, he's now reached a point where all he can do is hurt her. And she reacts in the most horrifying possible way, which we then get later on. Virgil says, "Dido, what then? When you discerned the way things were, O wretched love, to what extremes will you not drive the souls of mortals?" And with that, we leave her. We leave Dido burning on the pyre as Aeneas travels away. Like I say, she will come back. She will come back in a way that is sort of indicative of how she haunts the memory of the West. And I think that Virgil is here also saying that Carthage haunts the memory of Rome, right? Remember that Carthage is the city that Dido is founding. It is the empire that Rome had to destroy to gain control of the Mediterranean. And there was an enormous respect there, as well as an antipathy and of violence, right? That they destroyed Carthage. Carthage, in some sense, Virgil, I think, is suggesting Carthage also self-destructed. This was part of the Roman narrative, at least, about what happened in the Third Punic War. How true it is or not, I mean, it's certainly, there's probably some truth to it. But the Romans were also, Cato especially, were devoted to Carthago delenda est, right? They were devoted to Carthage must be destroyed. And so the moment that Carthage gave an opportunity in the Third Punic War, Rome kind of swept in and destroyed this ancient rival. But she was also beautiful, right? Carthage was the most ancient civilization, perhaps, that Rome had made contact with up to that point. And so there is this sorrow and elegy to it, as well as the sense of necessity, that Rome had to be great, and so Carthage had to fall. Carthage, in some sense, leaned into that, self-destructed. And Dido embodies all of that as she goes up in flames, but she haunts, as she says she will, she haunts the memory of Rome. She haunts the memory of the West. I would suggest that she haunts our memory too. Okay, that's a lot. Big feelings about Dido. Let's do a couple last things as we wrap up here, and then we will be moving on. We're going to just spend one episode on book 5, because it's book 6, really, that I want to get us to. But we'll be moving on next time. First, however, we have to do It Figures. This is my little segment where I talk about figures of speech, rhetorical tropes, ways that Virgil uses language. And there's one word that I want to teach you this week that I love. I'm realizing one of my favorite kinds of tropes is the kind that involves not saying things, or when you break off, when you stop speaking. We talked about one before, which is praeteritio. Praeteritio is where you say something by talking about how you're not going to talk about it. So, like, I'm not saying, I'm just saying. Like, don't even get me started. I won't even mention her drinking problem. That's praeteritio. The other one, which I also really like, is aposiopesis. Siope is the Greek root for silence. And so aposiopesis is a sudden falling silent, right? Falling short. And we have a number of those here. In particular, strikingly, the narrator kind of does an aposiopesis when he says, at the very first quote I read, who can deceive a lover? It's at regina dolos, quis fallere possit amantem praesensit. Now, it's not a full-fledged aposiopesis because he does pick up the sentence at the end here, but it's definitely meant to be an interjection, right? It's a kind of aside that we get that cuts off the grammar of one sentence and introduces a new sentence. It's also, by the way, a rhetorical question, which is called an erotema in the library of rhetorical tropes. So, quis fallere possit amantem, who can deceive a lover? We all know the answer, no one, right? So that's a rhetorical question, dropped right into the middle of this sentence. The true aposiopesis is where you just, like, shut down entirely, and you say, you know, I ran into Sally at the grocery store, and you know Sally well, and then you just don't say anything at all, because everyone knows that, like, Sally is a bit like of a gossip or whatever else, you know, it is that you're not saying. I get this a lot in the South, actually, people just ending mid-sentence to convey what they expect me to pick up. But here we get the sentence picked back up again. So maybe this is closest to the Trump weave. If you listened to Donald Trump on Rogan, he talked about how even though he does stop, Trump does a lot of aposiopesis. If you listen to him, he will break off in mid-sentence and talk about something else. And so Marco Rubio, I call him Little Marco. He's so funny. Like, he's like wandering away. But he points out on Rogan that he always comes back to the original sentence, right? He kind of weaves his way, and that's why he calls it the weave. He's like, at the end of the digression, he will return. So it's kind of like it's a combination of aposiopesis and what you would call asyndeton, which is where you leave out the conjunctions and you just switch from clause to clause without a but or an and. You would expect here, there's also asyndeton in this line from Virgil. Regina dolos, you would expect a nam. Regina dolos nam quis fallere possit amantem. But he doesn't give you that, so it is much more of like a breaking off mid-sentence. And the effects of this are clear, right? It's like something that breaks its way into the thought, right? There's a lot of disjointed, disordered syntax in both Aeneas and Dido's speeches, because they're both highly emotional, and that's one way that we show emotion in epic. But here, the narrator himself kind of breaks off, right? Who can deceive a lover? It's almost like it's almost like a rare moment of like Italian emotion for Virgil, right? Who can deceive a lover? Like there's just something kind of so overwrought about it that I really love, and of course it expresses something universal and true, which is that like it's impossible, right, to escape the notice of somebody that is really devoted to you, that cares a lot about you, that's paying a lot of attention to you. So 3 new words here to learn, each one kind of serving a different function. Asyndeton, where you miss the links between ideas, so there's no conjunction in this quis fallere possit amantem, that's asyndeton. Aposiopesis, where you fall short or you stop in the middle of a sentence and you move on to something else, also known as the trump weave. And then erotema, the rhetorical question, all kind of bound up in this one little line: who can deceive a lover? Who can deceive one who loves? All right, that's it, figures. And now, finally, let's do the mailbag. So mailbag questions come to me on Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. That is the easiest way to get in touch with me, to read my writing, to just do all the stuff that we love to do together. And if you write me a direct message, whether you're a free or a paid subscriber, you can be in the mailbag. Today I have a question from Cassie about how to pursue classical studies as an adult. After you graduate from college or you're done with high school, how do you pursue classical studies? So Cassie writes, I am thinking about going back to school to get my degree in classical studies at a school in Oregon. I spoke with the chair of the department, and she was very eager to signal her politics, which felt irrelevant and disappointing. I want to learn about the ancient world because I'm fascinated and curious. I don't want to be presented with a single perspective without being able to educate myself on other perspectives, especially when it comes to biblical texts and the values of the Western canon. If there are politically charged values being smuggled in, I accept that this will happen. I just want to be aware when it is. What resources do you recommend so I can have my own sort of parallel education while I'm studying, if necessary? Okay, great. Yes. So this is, I think, a question that a lot of people are facing. Many once great universities, unfortunately, have begun to treat the canon or to treat literature in general as not for its own sake, but as sort of fodder for a political agenda or a program. Now, it also happens that I personally disagree with the politics of most like Ivy League professors. That much is established and clear. But that's actually not quite my objection. My objection is that when you treat literature the way that it is often treated, for instance, at this place that Cassie is going to, right, you lose sight of the text itself. You start to make it into a like sounding board for your own preoccupations, which is just a way of trapping yourself in a smaller and smaller form of narcissism, right? Just like curling in onto your own beliefs and views and showing how Shakespeare is like too misogynist to live up to your own standards, rather than asking like, what are Shakespeare's actual, like, what is the world that produced Shakespeare? What does he have to say about women and men and the relations between them, right? And so this is, to me, completely poisonous. And I think it's a reason why many institutions of higher learning are deservedly losing public trust. Now, you can get too broad brush about this. And always with politics, it's easy to be like, yeah, the universities, they all suck, right? And there is a real crisis, a problem of this in America, but also it's very much still possible to find great academics working at great universities doing good stuff. And so this is why I think the first thing I want to commend you on, Cassie, is that you're talking to people. This is what, whenever anybody asks me, like, should I go to grad school? How should I find out which grad school to go to? Blah, blah, blah. This is the first thing I say is that, like, take away every thought you might have about a credential or a degree or a name, right? The brand that you want to go to this Ivy League or that special school, right? Stop thinking about that and start thinking about people, relationships. What's teaching really? It's a human relationship between individuals. And you want to find a relationship with somebody that knows more about this and genuinely wants to pass that along. And so before you sign up for a program, no matter how good it looks on paper, talk to the people involved, email the professors. They're often very willing to talk to prospective students. Find out what kind of people they are. Do I gel with this person? Do I think that this person is going to inspire me with his love or her love of the subject? And if not, you don't need to go to that school, right? So my first question for you, Cassie, is like, do you actually want to do a degree in classical studies? Or do you just want to learn the classics, right? Do you want to steep yourself in the kinds of works of literature that we talk about on this show? In which case, that's a very different project. It might involve getting a degree, and you might get a credential at the end. But one consequence of the breakdown in our university is that those degrees, like, they're not the point. They really aren't. There's some jobs and certain occupations in which you do need the credential. I have had to use my PhD to get into certain rooms sometimes. And there are also programs that can train you in a discipline. Like, for instance, I did a research degree, which means I learned how to do research. And that's useful when I write books, right? Like, I have a toolkit at my disposal for finding things out, a way of talking to other academics that we can understand one another and appreciate and critique each other's work. All of that stuff is helpful to me, because my task or job in life is to be, I don't know, like a public intellectual or whatever you want to call it, right? But that might not quite be your task, Cassie. Like that, unless, correct me if I'm wrong, like it doesn't sound like you want to be a writer so much as you want to enrich your life with these wonderful works, and you should. If you can find a course that can do that for you by talking to the individuals involved, definitely go take it. But the other thing I want to stress to you is that first and foremost, and this is why I think the politics is so harmful, you always want to be going back to the primary texts. Always, always, always return to the texts. They're easier, actually, to get a hold of and to understand than these abstruse theories that people layer on to try to explain Shakespeare away to himself or whatever, right? So I've recommended before the University of Chicago put out a collection of classic texts that I don't recommend reading that collection cover to cover. But I do recommend, and I'll link to it again in the description of this show, I do recommend using it as a jumping off point and a map. Because the first thing you need a sense of like, what is the lay of the land? What are the ancient texts that most people will kind of know about? What are the medieval texts and what are the modern texts? And as you start to get into that, like, let's say threshold, as you start to explore that list of great works, you can then follow the doors that you find most intriguing and exciting, and you don't need anybody's permission to do that. You can like noodle around on YouTube. You can be like taking courses online. There are some great podcast courses from Yale and Harvard that are not all that politically motivated, that are really interesting. You can find all of those. But the thing that you want, which is a touchstone, a way to measure all of these secondary sources against like the original core primary thing, that's called the primary text. That's called reading the original stuff. So I would recommend the University of Chicago kind of series as a jumping off point. Obviously this podcast, obviously the Ancient Language Institute. But my main message to you is always, always, always go back to the primary texts. Seek relationships with people who can help you to understand those texts, but don't feel like you need permission or a credential in order to evaluate somebody's like weird theory about the texts. It's the texts themselves and your engagement with them that will give you the authority, that will give you the right to comment with anybody and discuss with anybody whether or not their weird interpretation is correct. I hope that helps. Thank you, Cassie, for that wonderful question. Thank you all for listening. It's been a joy to be with you as always. Please do check out my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. Don't forget to rate this podcast 5 stars, share it around, let the people know. We will pick up with the Aeneid as we move forward into book 6, and I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.